Welcome back, all you lovely people. As always, I hope you enjoyed your time with Mr. Green. So I think that is a pretty good broad introduction to utilitarianism. Now, in this video, I want to dig deeper into Bentham's understanding of the greater good, and how he promotes it through his understanding. Again, all these elements, I'll just pop them up there again, all these elements of classical utilitarianism that I want to walk us through. Now, I'll start with this bold statement that begins the work by Bentham. He starts with this bold statement of what we would call hedonism, and this is on page 17. So let's look over here at page 17, where you see him say, he opens this up saying, I love this, it's so dramatic. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chains of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So we see Bentham here making he's doing kind of simultaneously, he's doing a psychological claim about human behavior as well as a normative claim about how we should act. Because he's starting with this, just what he thinks is just painfully obvious observation that people always, or at least usually, tend to be motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Indeed, he says, you look at all life, you'll see it when something's pleasurable, that there's a natural attraction to that thing. And when something is painful, there's a natural kind of revulsioning trying to get away from it. He thinks this is just almost instinctual. And so this is a psychological claim that that's what we tend to do, because he just thinks this is obvious. He says, when we humans, whatever, talk about happiness, we clearly are talking about, these positive feelings of pleasure. And when we're talking about unhappiness, we're talking about these negative feelings of pain. He thinks this is just like painfully obvious. And it's worth noting, this is a statement of hedonism. Where well-being is nothing other than happiness, understood as pleasure and absence of pain. Now recall, I introduced this idea actually earlier back in the module when we were talking about ethical egoism and Ayn Rand. Remember, this was the idea, again, hedonism, this idea that well-being is happiness is pleasure. And so we talked about that, though you will recall Ayn Rand did not like discussions of pleasure because she thought this seemed to be something for a mindless brute. And here's how I think Bentham would respond, but Ayn Rand says, yeah, happiness, pleasure, that's the happiness of a mindless brute. And I think Bentham would turn to her and be like, girl, listen up. It's really patriarchal. Oh, he'd probably be nicer than that because he was for women's rights. He might say, give me a break. Is that nicer? You just say, come on, Miss Rand. People clearly seek out pleasure and people clearly avoid pain. When we talk about happiness, we're somehow talking about an experience of pleasure and the absence or diminishment of pain. He just says, let's just have a morality that's honest about that. And that's honest that that's what we tend to like and, seek out. We seek out pleasure. We try to avoid pain. Just be honest. That's what we do. And so let's have a morality that's about that. That's about promoting that kind of happiness. As again, pleasure, absence of pain. And so this is a statement, is a core part of, again, Bentham's hedonism, which as I just said, which just means well-being is nothing other than happiness, understood as pleasure and absence of pain. And so what Bentham is doing here, I'll just spell it out, maybe it's clear, but just in case, what we see Bentham here doing is Bentham is defining a person's well-being as happiness, and happiness is then defined as pleasure and absence of pain. Pretty straightforward. And I think if you jump to page 18 of the text, so let's go to page 18, and you can see Bentham say, by utility is meant the property of any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. And there's the important part. All this in the present case comes to the same thing. And so again, here we just see him defining this idea of utility, which is just going to be, the measure of happiness. Utility is the measure of happiness. And he says, well, happiness is just pleasure. That's just moral goodness. And so utility is just measuring the moral goodness of something because it's measuring the pleasure. It's measuring the happiness. These, again, he says, are all the same thing. He's not going to distinguish these. He wants to give it kind of a name, so he calls it utility, just to kind of sum up that all these things are the same, and that's what he wants to measure and be concerned with. This is the utility. And so to give it a name, yeah, utility is the name. But again, when he talks about utility, he's talking about how much pleasure, how much happiness, how much good is it producing? Again, all the same for him. Now, I will say, this is probably already, the smart student amongst you has already realized, wait a minute, this sounds like a familiar problem that you've seen before. And that's right. We have seen a problem here cooking, and that's the is-ought problem. Recall, we saw that in Mr. Green's video about natural teleology, this is-ought problem. Now, you might, what was that again? The is-ought problem, if you might recall, just says that just because something is a certain way does not mean that it has to, or that it should be that way. So again, just because something is a certain way does not mean that it should or ought to be that way. We don't just get to go from it is to it ought to be without an argument. And so this is what critics of Bentham often say. They say, hey, Bentham, buddy, just because people seem to like pleasure and avoid pain, that doesn't mean that that's what morality should be doing. Lots of critics make this about Bentham. And now here's what I think Bentham would say to that. And this might also help explain why Bentham, likes hedonism and how he would respond to his critics, and also to like someone like Ayn Rand. I think he would say, look, if you think that we should be caring about the interests of other people, let's just start with that. You see that if you like that principle of equal treatment, if you like that minimum conception of morality, well, what does the principle of equal treatment say? What does the minimum conception of morality say? They all seem to agree. We should be caring about the interests of other people. Bentham just says, look, if you're at least willing to like that idea, yeah, okay, let's care about the interests of others. And then, well, if we're caring about the interests of others, we definitely should be caring about the well-being of others. And then, well, what do we mean by well-being? Well, it looks like we just mean happiness. Are they happy? That's the well-being. And of course, shouldn't happiness be something that everyone actually wants? It seems weird to have a morality of happiness that's making people do things that they don't enjoy doing. That seems to be weird. And so, yeah, the idea, as Bentham would say, is that morality, if it's about promoting everyone's well-being, well, then it's about promoting everyone's happiness. He thinks it's obvious. He thinks, well, if we're talking about happiness, happiness should be something we all care about and like and want. And well, what is that? Well, of course, that's pleasure and absence of pain. And again, we'll just call that tendency of something to produce that happiness, to produce that well-being, to produce that good. We'll call that utility. And bam, utilitarian, baby. What did I just say? Utilitarianism. Ruh, ruh, ruh. Utilitarianism. Yeah, he's... That's it, right? To be honest, I think I've just summarized a huge chunk of his argument very quickly there, because I think that little argument reveals a lot about what's going on with Bentham. Again, because we can go back to all these features of classical utilitarianism. And so let's just jump to the top of that list there, and we can see that Bentham, in what I've just said, accepts what we can call consequentialism. Now, consequentialism is the idea that the overall goodness of outcomes, that is the goodness of outcomes for everyone affected by those outcomes, that is the only thing with intrinsic moral value. And so I think we actually can see two different things going on in consequentialism, both very important for Bentham and for utilitarianism. First, as we see in Mr. Green's video, which you just watched, I hope, Bentham thinks morality is about the consequences of actions. Bentham does not particularly care about your motives, your intentions, or why it is you're doing something. He cares more about the outcome, the consequences, what is produced by your action. So again, he's not interested in your motives or why you did it. He cares about the impact. It's not about intent, it's about impact. What impact has your action actually had on people? And so, for instance, if you see that drowning child that Peter Singer likes to talk about, Bentham would only care that you ended up saving a life. You made the child happy. You made the child's family happy at the very least. And Bentham does not give a darn. He doesn't give a hoot what your intent was. Maybe you did it for a reward. Maybe you did it for a sense of duty. Different intentions. Bentham says, I don't care. What was the impact? And the impact was you saved a life. Period. All that matters is the consequences, the impact of your actions, not the intention or why you did it. So again, we're talking about consequentialism. Throw it back up there. Consequentialism, the overall goodness of outcomes, that is the goodness of the outcomes for everyone affected by those outcomes, is the only thing with intrinsic moral value. And so the first thing I just mentioned that we see is that, again, only outcomes and consequences matter. We care about the impact of action, not the motivation, not the intent. Why you did it does not matter. Focus on the impact, not the intent, says Bentham, and classical utilitarianism and consequentialism. Now, there's a second feature of consequentialism that's worth noting as well, that is quite clear. Consequentialism cares about how the outcomes affect everyone. On page 42, jump on over there to page 42, we can see Bentham says that we should care about extent. That is, the number of persons to whom it extends, or in other words, who are affected by it. So here, with consequentialism, we're also seeing that we now have the opposite. Maybe not the opposite, but we don't have ethical egoism. This rejects ethical egoism. Recall, ethical egoism says you should only care about how the outcomes affect you. But consequentialism says you need to care about how the outcome affects everyone. Now, that does include you. You matter, but it includes everyone. So again, this is not about prudence or only caring about your own interest. This also is not about altruism or only caring about everyone else. This is about consequentialism, a general responsiveness to the interests of everyone involved. So yeah, we're having a new idea that's not prudence, not altruism, it's consequentialism. And one more time, consequentialism, a general responsiveness to the interests of everyone involved. And again, that includes you and everyone else. So what we can see is this idea that consequentialism is trying to integrate the concerns of prudence with the concerns of altruism. It's not you versus the world anymore, or everyone else. It's all of this matters, you and everyone else. So it's not an either or, it's a both.
¿Por qué no los dos?
And Bentham is clearly not a fan of ethical egoism or some kind of ethics of selfishness. If you jump to page 21, you can see some interesting remarks that Bentham kind of has. They're kind of throwaway remarks, but I think they really do show the contempt he has for ethical egoism, because he has obvious disdain here on page 21 where he talks about principles that are despotical and hostile to all the rest of the human race. Yeah, that doesn't sound good. And he later speaks about principles that are anarchical, and whether, about anarchy, and whether or not at this rate there are not as many different standards of right and wrong as there are men, as there are people. And so, yeah, Bentham is saying in those little passages there that selfish principles, a concern only for yourself that ethical egoism wants. Yeah, he says these embrace principles that are despotical, or the principles of a despot or a tyrant. You're putting your interests before everyone else. That's tyrannical. That's despotical. That's clearly not supposed to be a good thing, according to, you wouldn't use that language if you liked it. Or ethical egoism, he says, embraces principles that are like anarchy, that are anarchical. I hope I'm saying that right. Someone can correct me on Twitter. But again, because principles that are anarchical just says that, well, everyone just is going to have their own separate interests and everyone's going to be going out trying to fight for their own interests. And we get,
dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Anarchy. But apart from that, I will say we don't get an obvious argument for Bentham about why we should care about the happiness of others. He clearly thinks we should care about the happiness of others, but why? Why should I care? I mean, look, I think it's easy to say, hey, Bentham, we're with you, that I'm after my happiness. I really like my happiness. And I'm sure you all feel the same way. You all like your happiness, your pleasure. You all want to avoid pain. I want to avoid pain. But why should any of us care about everyone's pleasure? And, especially those people who are affected by my actions. And I think we can start this argument by going back to hedonism. Again, according to hedonism, it's pretty plain. All that matters morally is pleasure and absence of pain. And we can ask ourselves, is my pleasure any different from your pleasure? Is your pleasure different from the pleasure of your classmates or anyone else on this planet? And is my pleasure any less important to me than your pleasure is important to you? And so we're starting to, again, this might sound familiar. We're kind of getting that principle of equal treatment once again, that I should only be able to treat my pleasures as different from your pleasures, and you can only treat your pleasures as different from everyone else's pleasures if there is a relevant difference between my pleasures and your pleasures. And Bentham would say there's only one relevant difference. If all you care about is pleasure, the only thing that matters is how much pleasure. The amount of pleasure matters. It does not matter who has the pleasure. We care about morally, we care about producing more pleasure. So again, the focus isn't on who has the pleasure. The focus is on how much pleasure has been produced. Again, pleasure over pain, if you want to always assume that. I'm just focusing on pleasure. But again, if all that matters is pleasure, it seems that we should be doing whatever it takes. If you're a true hedonist says all that matters is pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And if really that's all you care about, then you should be promoting that. You should be promoting that pleasure. And again, it doesn't matter whose pleasure it is. All people are morally equal. No one's pleasure counts more than anyone else's pleasure. So again, the only thing that would separate us, that would make a difference, isn't that these are Professor Gray's pleasures and those are your pleasures. The difference is how much pleasure. Is Professor Gray getting a lot of pleasure? And is that creating a lot of pain in you? That's what matters, is the amounts being produced. And by the way, you might note that this means then that any sentient being matters according to Bentham and utilitarians. Again, any sentient being, any being that's capable of experiencing pleasure and pain matters. Because again, we don't care about, is it a human that's experiencing pleasure and pain? No, we just care about, is it a being that's experiencing it? So again, dogs, cats, horses, all sentient life starts to matter because they too can experience pain. And so indeed, Bentham did think that animals should get certain protections. We shouldn't be cruel, torturing animals. And we'll read in the next module, Peter Singer will actually, again, Peter Singer's also a utilitarian, and he thinks all animals are equal. We'll get to that. That's jumping too ahead. That's next module. But this one, again, I think this is how Bentham would justify his acceptance of consequentialism. Again, why we should care about everyone, because his concern is for the happiness of everyone, because pleasure is what matters to him. And we need to promote pleasure in all life that can experience pleasure. So I think that's how he's going to justify it. Again, it's not who or what is experiencing the pleasure. It's just how much pleasure is being produced. And that amount of pleasure is what we want to increase. And so the only finally missing piece here that kind of, I think, just connects it all together is Bentham's acceptance of welfarism. Now, welfarism is the idea that the overall goodness of an outcome is measured solely by the well-being of everyone affected. And so this is making the connection now between goodness, well-being, and then hedonism will connect well-being to happiness and pleasure. And so again, we can put this all together now. Here, I'll throw this up here for you, that, we see that consequentialism is emphasizing that morality only should focus on the overall goodness of outcomes, overall meaning for everyone, and the outcomes, again, the consequences. So again, the consequential emphasizes that morality only focus on the overall goodness of outcomes. That's consequentialism, basically. Welfarism says that the overall goodness is overall well-being. And hedonism says that overall well-being is overall happiness. And hedonism also says, of course, that overall happiness is itself overall pleasure and absence of pain. And so now we can put this all together and say morality only focuses on the overall pleasure and absence of pain. Indeed, this is the core tenet of classical utilitarianism. That morality is about overall pleasure and absence of pain. Of course, the question now is, how is Bentham going to measure pleasure and pain? And he does it with one interesting trick. Oh, more clickbait. Click, 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 click. Because I want to take a snack break. I want to produce some pleasure in myself. And that's going to be, you know what, going to involve some Cheetos. Let's maximize my pleasure. Let's maximize your pleasure with a nice, tasty snack. So let's all get our snacks. Feel good, wash up, and then we'll come back and talk about how Bentham measures pleasure and pain. See you back in a moment.